I'd like to start by introducing our keynote speaker for the symposium. And I really think that there is really no one more eligible, in a sense, to be the keynote speaker for what we're talking about than Ester. So let me tell you a little bit about her esteemed background. The topic that she will be speaking on today is one that really draws on her prolific history of research on Chinese Buddhist monasticism. The topic is Case Studies in Chinese Buddhist Monasticism, Navigating Networks, Hybridity, and the Interplay of History and Fieldwork. So Professor Ester Bianchi holds a PhD in Indian and East Asian civilization from the University of Venice. It was awarded in co-tutorship with the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. She's currently Associate Professor of Chinese Religions and Philosophy and Society and Culture of China at the University of Baruga, where she also coordinates the double degree programs in World Religions and Philosophy and Cultural Heritage, Religion and Society. And this is in collaboration with the Department of Religious Studies at Fudan University in Taipei. Her research affiliations include membership in the Culture, Languages, Practices Research Group at the University of Baruga, as well as serving as an external associate researcher with the Society's Religions Secularities Group in Paris. She's also been a research fellow at the Wutai International Institute of Buddhism and East Asian Culture since 2016. And she's also a contributor to the research project Chinese Buddhism in Globalization, States, Communities, and Practices of Religion, which is directed by Yoshiko Ashiwa and David Wank and is funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. So Professor Bianchi's publications reflect a sustained engagement with Chinese and Tibetan Buddhism, with Chinese religion, and the transmission of religious texts and practices across cultures. She is the author of The Iron Statue Monastery, Tiexiangsi, a Buddhist nunnery of the Tibetan tradition in contemporary China, that was published in 2001. She's authored also a general volume on the histories, practices, and cultural traditions of Taoism, that was published in 2009. And she also produced the first Italian translation of the Gaoseng Faxian Duan, which was published in Italian as Faxian, a Chinese pilgrim in 5th century India. In addition to these sole-authored works, she's also co-edited or collaborated on a number of other volumes, including Facets of the Tibetan Religious Tradition and Contacts with Neighboring Cultural Areas, in collaboration with Alfredo Cardona in 2002. She collaborated with Shen Wei-rong on Sino-Tibetan Buddhism Across the Ages, which came out in 2021. And also most recently with Daniele Campo in 2023 on Take the Vinaya as Your Master, Monastic Discipline and Practices in Modern Chinese Buddhism. So in addition to this, she is the author of numerous articles and chapters on topics such as modern interpretations of Vinaya and ordination practices, the transmission and transformation of Sino-Tibetan Buddhism in modern China, gender and monastic discipline, and the adaptation of Tantric and Yogacara teachings in contemporary contexts. Her work deals with, engages with pivotal figures in modern Chinese Buddhism, such as Neng Hai and Long Lian, and also explores developments across both mainland China and transnational Chinese Buddhist communities. So as I've said, it would be difficult to find someone more qualified or indeed more inspiring than Ester to deliver our keynote today. And we're so delighted, Ester, that you accepted the invitation. And please, everyone, join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much, Kat, for this wonderful presentation, which I don't think I deserve, but I'm really grateful. So shall I begin or Is it time?
Yes, please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So I first would like to express my sincere gratitude to Catherine Hardy for inviting me to serve as a keynote speaker at this interesting symposium. I deeply regret and apologize that I am not able to join you in person due to institutional duties at my home university. I am sure that the presentations, discussions, and exchanges taking place in these 2 days will provide valuable insights for all of us in our respective research. And I look forward to attending as many sessions as possible given the time zone difference. Just let me start my... Okay. So, this said, let me begin with a fieldwork note from 2001. Okay. Written while I was staying at Ganglus on Jiuhuashan with Guoping Shefu, a then young Chinese bhikshuni from Sichuan, whom I had first met in 1996 in Chengdu, and who was now accompanying on a pilgrimage to Southeast China and Anhui. I read the translation from Italian. July 28, Saturday, 2001. This morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. It was Guoping Shefu knocking at the door to go for a walk. After breakfast, at 8, I followed her to the Institute of Buddhist Studies, where she gave a 2.5-hour lecture to a class composed solely of monks, regardless of the 8 Guru Dharmas. She spoke about herself, her personal experience when she took monastic vows, the 2 Tibetan traditions her practice belongs to, her life with her master Longlien, the Institute of Buddhist Studies at Yeshianse, and her Shangshi, her present-day Tibetan master. The difference in her delivery was remarkable, calm and detached in the first part, emotional, intense in the second. She answered all sorts of questions with ease, even daring to criticize the Renjian for Jiao. How humanistic Buddhism is not Buddhist, she claimed. And more generally, the state of Buddhism in contemporary China. Can we really be content to just sit in a hall and only get up to ring the bell when a visitor enters, as I have seen many monastics do during my visits to the southeast, she asked. She spoke passionately about the Tibetan tradition, the importance of Dharma lineage, and of the presence of the master, explaining concepts such as tulku, inyuan, etc., with precision and clarity. She also criticized the Chinese institutes of Buddhist studies for their excessive focus on textual learning and lack of attention to spiritual practice. I was so proud of her. Unquote. Guoping is my Kalyana Mitra, my Shangyu, in my research experience. She was introduced to me by Venerable Longlien when I first visited Tieshianse on January 2nd, 1996. And since then, she has been guiding and supporting my studies throughout. In 1996, Guoping was one of the most promising students of the prestigious Sichuan Institute of Buddhist Studies for Bhikshunis, the first school founded by Longlien for nuns in the People's Republic of China to be recognized as equivalent to a university degree. She was the one who introduced me to the complex etiquette of Buddhism. I later accompanied her on pilgrimages to Lhasa and multiple times to Kham, but also to Suzhou and as seen to Mount Jiuhua. She also came to visit me in Italy. I read her writings, listened to her deliver Dharma talks, teachings, and scholarly lectures, received donations from lay people, bless the elderly and the children, care for the sick in hospitals, giving interviews to television journalists, and record mantras for a record label in Chengdu. Today, she's the beloved abbess of Baitas in Chongzhou, Sichuan, revered by her nuns, who, and I was there a few years ago, asked her to assume the role when Baitas was at risk of closing, as well as by the many devotees who gather at the temple for Tibetan-style meditation retreats or for Chinese-style rituals during major religious festivals. Given her role in my studies, and I would say also my life, Guopin will serve as the fil rouge connecting the dots of my presentation today. The anecdote I just read from my field diaries of 24 years ago serves as an introduction to some of the topics I will address today, such as the divide between female and male communities and the challenges of researching female versus male monastics, the necessity of distinguishing between elite individuals and the broader monastic community, the separation and intersections between traditional or dharma lineages, how you want to call them, where knowledge is transmitted in ways that can vary significantly between institutions, and educational ties formed in academies with standardized textbook-based curricula. When Professor Hardy, first reached out to me with this generous invitation, I asked myself what kind of contribution I could offer to such a varied and specialized group of social scientists focused on Chinese and Tibetan religions in the contemporary world. What could I bring to the discussion on exploring contemporary monastic religiosities? The answer, in fact, came from Kat herself, who suggested that my keynote might weave together insights from my research across various traditions and contexts. She encouraged me to deliver a historical grounded cross-regional presentation. And I have to say that I really enjoyed opening my fieldwork diaries and reading through the notes taken by my younger self over the years. I am grateful for this opportunity. Naturally, the scope of material I thought I would include today and that I have included in my abstract far exceeds what could be covered in 45 minutes presentation. Therefore, I will focus on a select few exemplary cases from my 30 years of research in the mainland China, drawing on my broader experience also elsewhere to provide context and general reflections. As a matter of fact, as a historian of Chinese religions and as a sinologist, my interests have often centered on modern developments in Buddhist rituals and practices in China, and fieldwork within living monastic institutions has thus played a crucial role in my published work. To begin with, let me share with you a few images from some of my fieldwork over the years as a way to introduce the case studies that will recur during this presentation. They are listed here, so it's 4 of them. We have Tiexiangse, where I've been conducting research from 1995 actually down to 2012. Then Duobaojiangse, Tiexiangse, of course, is in Sichuan. Duobaojiangse, on the other hand, is in Zhejiang, and I was there in 2001 and 2013. And then Baitase in Sichuan, where I've been from 2006 onward down to 2019. And finally, Shehose, a new field for me, which I visited in 2018 and 19. We are again in Sichuan, so 3 of the 4 are from Sichuan. So before delving into the topic of the interplay of religious and institutional monastic identities, I would like to briefly discuss my research methodology with you, which may differ in significant ways from the approaches adopted by other participants at this symposium. I will also share my perspective on the theoretical concept of hybridity, a recurring theme throughout my publications, regardless of shifts in my research focus. So first, something about my methodology. So the methodology I employ as a religious studies scholar in my research on contemporary Chinese Buddhism is based on several different, often interconnected methods, including historical analysis, textual analysis, and fieldwork. As pointed out by Daniela Campo and Vincent Goussard in an article on the social sciences of religion and the Chinese case that was published in French, this approach is typical of religious studies scholars who have been trained in area studies, usually with a focus on classical studies. I do identify myself with this description. From this background comes a historical and textual approach, which is predominant, as well as a perspective oriented toward the past and the resilience of a given tradition. Thus, a textual and historical approach is what distinguishes the sinologists specializing in modern Chinese religions from the anthropologist counterparts. Nevertheless, the necessity of fieldwork leads scholars of Chinese religions interested in contemporary issues to adopt ethnographic techniques and to engage with recent transformations and local issues as anthropologists usually tend to do. To be sure, fieldwork conducted by religious studies scholars often involves participant observation and interviews, of course, but it is frequently more a means to other ends, such as accessing texts or details of rituals and practices, than the main focus of the research itself. As a result, the fieldwork conducted in this way may sometimes appear unstructured or even casual to those trained in strict ethnographic research. Rather than viewing this as a weak point, I see the two approaches as distinct and complementary, as they produce alternative and supplementary data about the very same site. So in short, in my approach, the study of contemporary social structures of a given area and site is combined with the research and analysis of the textual heritage of a particular community. I would like to add here a few additional methodological concerns related to gender issues, which I present as open questions and conundrums deserving further discussion. As I have recently discussed with Raoul Birnbaum, but we may be wrong in this, and so please tell me, we think that the impact of gender on researchers themselves has not yet been scientifically sufficiently studied. When conducting fieldwork, we all know this, in a monastery, regardless of whether one is a historian or an anthropologist, one gains access to information that would otherwise be unavailable, including personal issues and general matters related to the challenges and realities of monastic life. Gaining access to female communities may thus be easier for a female researcher, in part due to Vinaya rules that impose gender segregation. The same holds true for the opposite case. Male researchers generally have easier access to male communities. While this is not an absolute rule, my own experience has shown that conducting fieldwork as a female researcher in a male monastic community is significantly more complex and less fruitful than doing so in a female community. And here comes one of my first fields in Zhejiang. I have conducted extensive fieldwork in a male monastery only once. This was within the community of Zhimin, whom you see here, at Duobaojiang in Zhejiang, where I stayed from July to September 2001. So it was rather long, for a historian, rather long fieldwork. I was there to carry out research for my PhD on Lama Nanghai's Tantric teachings. And while the purpose of my visit did not present any obstacles, I was able to interview the abbot multiple times, collect materials, and read parts of them with him and other senior masters. I encountered some unprecedented challenges with participant observation. As a woman, I was required to stay in the lay women's quarters outside the monastery, since women were only permitted to enter the monastery before 6 and had to leave before 5 p.m. Furthermore, the monastery adhered strictly to Vinaya rules. Thus, younger monks, so the majority of the community, were not allowed to converse alone with me and were even discouraged from making eye contact with me. As a result, my interactions were limited to the laity and senior masters, which prevented me from accessing the kind of information that would have given me a deeper understanding of the community. Now, let me just move to some theoretical framework. Because in preparing for this talk, I realized that I am particularly drawn to exploring the blending and the hybridization of practices rather than simply tracing the evolution of a single tradition. So here in this list, you can see the monasteries that I have already presented to you and some other of my major field sites, and they all have hybrid practices within them. So on the whole, the monastic communities I have been working on, regardless of how different their religious identities may be, all display forms of religious hybridity in their practices. Hybridity, as I understand it, is a concept that involves interactions and cultural exchanges resulting from transculturalism and globalization. Historically, I connect this specific phenomena, that is, Chinese Buddhists adopting alternative views or practices and blending them within a Chinese Buddhist context, so this kind of phenomena, to the spread of a Pan-Asian perspective of Buddhism during early 20th century. To be clear, for me, the term hybridity does not refer to Homi Bhabha's concept of minority resilience in relation to a dominant culture, nor it is limited to the characteristic of frontier zones as described by Fabienne Jagoux. In the cases I have focused on most during my field research, Chinese Buddhists have consciously integrated elements from other cultural backgrounds with the intention of enriching and completing their own practices. This applies to the so-called Sino-Tibetan tradition founded by Nanhai and found at Yexianse, at the Hubao-Jiangse, but also on Mount Wutai. And here you can see that the blending, the hybridity also can involve Theravada elements. It also applies to the blending of Chinese Mahayana habits, concepts, and goals with Theravada practice at Shefose, where there is also place for Tibetan iconography, as you can see. It also applies somehow to the incorporation of early meditation practices and Theravada techniques in the Chan meditation program of the nuns at Huais in Rome, a subsidiary site of Juntai Shan in Puli, Taiwan. It's a case that I am not treating today, as I decided only to focus on mainland China, but actually it does apply also to that. So, scholars have long acknowledged the inherent ambiguity of the concept of hybridity, and I do know that. But along with Crady, I believe that the concept's multifaceted nature makes it a valuable category for defining the complexity of transnational and transcultural dynamics. To finish quickly, I promise, with this theoretical premise, I would like also to introduce to you another theoretical concept that I am embracing, and that has been recently formulated by Yoshiko Ashiwa, David Wong, and Jige in their forthcoming volume on the metamorphosis of Buddhism in New Era China. So it is the concept of metamorphosis, which they explain as a change in a phenomenon phenomenon's shape and appearance that nevertheless continues to contain its DNA. This concept is particularly useful for my case studies, as it allows me to establish links with Buddhist movements in the Republican era and more generally with a given historical tradition, while also highlighting changes, adjustments, and discontinuities. So, to close and approach the topic of religious and institutional identity, it is my conviction that in the cases I have been investigating, hybridity is what makes a particular institution, be it a monastery or a group of communities, unique, and is thus one of the major sources of religious and institutional identity. In other words, these monastic communities assert a clearly defined institutional identity, often reconnecting with specific lineages from the Republican era, by adopting hybrid forms of practice and ritual to define their religious identity. So, and while talking about monastic identities, a distinction should be made between female and male Buddhist monastic communities. This connects us with gender issues, which I have encountered in my own research, even though I have never been formally engaged in gender studies. Nevertheless, gender differences emerge very clearly from the field, regardless of the methodological or theoretical approach employed by the researcher. To say it in short, nuns' roles and agency are different from those of monks, and this is clear. So I came across this topic with Daniela Campo in our recent edited work. And I am now quoting our words from our introduction on monastic discipline and practices in modern Chinese Buddhism. So expectations are higher within monastic communities. Expectations are higher for nuns than for monks. And the preservation of established boundaries between the male and female parts of the Sangha represents a stake as important as the preservation of boundaries between monastics and the laity. And also further, stricter rules are applied to nuns. Even when both groups are expected to abide by the same normative rules of etiquette, many activities that are acceptable for monks are considered improper for nuns. The vast majority of Chinese Buddhist nuns deal with this disadvantage by capitalizing on a certain leeway of interpretation and compromise that allows them to follow Vinaya rules more or less strictly or loosely, and thereby affirm their identity without openly defying or disrupting the established hierarchy. However, in cases where gender hierarchies are endangered, the Vinaya can still be used as a tool to reassess the subordination of female practitioners to male practitioners, unquote. So much has been said about the re-emergence of the 8 Guru Dharmas in modern times, much by Melody Tselongtio, who is here today, much also by myself. The Guru Dharmas, as you all know, are rules believed to have been set by the Buddha Shakyamuni himself, which place bhikshunis under the authority of the Bhikshu Sangha. Even if this re-emergence in modern and contemporary times is often only theoretical, as the anecdote of Guo Ping teaching from a higher desk to a classroom of bhikshus demonstrates, in some cases it is still a factual reality. And by affirming the submission of nuns to monks, these rules also impact the roles bhikshunis can assume in the wider society, which can translate into lesser visibility and fewer economic resources. But this also is an ongoing metamorphosis, I believe. For instance, the affirmation of dual ordination, which is established by the 8 rules, and entails subordination by the nuns to the monks, in modern China was explained to me by Long Lian, the major promoter of this system today, together with Tong Yuan, as an improvement in the status of nuns within both the Buddhist Sangha and broader society. So importantly, to Long Lian, this was to be achieved without challenging traditional structures and gendered hierarchies. For Long Lian, the improvement of nun status meant working within the existing system to create more opportunities and recognitions for women, thereby fostering female empowerment within the Sangha without directly opposing established norms. And this, in a way, also applies to the field of education, with the establishment of modern institutes of Buddhist studies for nuns, for instance, which for Long Lian were means of female empowerment within the Sangha. This situation has recently been more complicated due to the fact that a growing number of bhikshunis exhibit higher levels of education even before entering the monastic order. A reality which is particularly true for Taiwanese Buddhism, where it has become a challenge to the established hierarchical system, as pointed out by Li Yuzhen, but which is increasingly spreading also in the People's Republic of China. So you can see here that, again, female monastics' identities is under metamorphosis process as well, as we have seen. So, going on, from my field experience, another important distinction in discussions of religious and institutional identity is between elite and ordinary monastics. It is typically the elite members of the Sangha who are able to move beyond institutions. Ordinary community members generally have less agency and tend to conflate their religiosity with that of their institution. In what follows, I will refer only to elitist monastics with a solid educational background. I recognize this as a limitation of my own research, which has mostly focused on the elite members of the Buddhist Sangha. And therefore, I encourage usually my students and young researchers to also study the laity and the ordinary monastics, but this is what I have been doing. So while it remains true that Buddhist monasteries can provide education for those from unprivileged backgrounds, prior education is a crucial factor for access to higher monastic education. Monastic education, in turn, is by far, in my view, is by far the most significant factor determining a monastic status in nowadays China. But there are various forms of education in contemporary Chinese Buddhism. The most well-known one is that of the HKU, the Institutes of Buddhist Studies. So modeled after the Buddhist academies of the Republican era, Institutes of Buddhist Studies, the HKU, generally provide an education based on textbooks following standardized curricula that tend to be broad rather than deep. As you probably all know, these curricula include subjects such as Buddhist history, literature, and philosophy taught by eminent members of the Sangha usually, while external professors usually teach courses in classical studies, calligraphy, traditional music, psychology, and so on and so forth. The programs also include political education, leadership training, and basic administrative training, as they are designed to train the new Sangha elite. Admission to the most prestigious of these schools requires passing highly selective entrance exams. So although there are exceptions, in practice, anyone without a solid secular education is essentially unable to pursue a career in the higher ranks of the Buddhist system. This form of education provides institutional identity, which is a strong one. We will go back to this, but only rarely, unless complemented by other forms of religious training, does it also produce a distinct religious identity. So the Sichuan Institute of Buddhist Studies for Bhikshunis, established by Long Lian in the early 80s and the subject of my earliest research in the 90s, belongs to this category. Over the past 40 years, including after its relocation to Penzhou, graduates of this institute have advanced to positions such as abbesses, I translate Juche as abbess here, instructors of Buddhist studies, and roles within the branches of the Buddhist Association of China, even if the vast majority of members of the Buddhist associations remain male. So notable alumni of the Sichuan Buddhist Institute include Master Ru Rui, Vice Secretary of the Buddhist Association of China and head of the Wutai Shan Pushou Se, the aforementioned Guo Ping, Abbess of Baitas, Rui, who became director of the Sichuan Institute of Buddhist Studies after Long Lian's passing. And another example that we will encounter again in my presentation today is Xu Zhi, abbess of Shefo Temple, who studied under Long Lian before graduating from the prestigious Minnan Buddhist Academy, where she taught for 6 years. These are just a few examples from my fieldwork demonstrating the importance of this form of officially recognized education in contemporary China. This modern form of erudition based on rote learning differs significantly from traditional monastic education. There are, however, alternatives to this standard model. As reported by Raoul Birbaum in the case of the Institute of Buddhist Studies founded by Miao Jin, I quote, in that Institute of Studies, emphasized focus is put on key texts at a time, with the intention of gaining deep knowledge that was woven into a practice regime to lead to achieve the state of non-retrogression on the bodhisattva path, so that one could then take an effective place of monastic responsibility, unquote. Sorry, I didn't read it well. I hope it was clear. So education and career advancement within the monastic community are also connected in this form of education, as you've seen. However, the emphasis is placed more on personal spiritual growth than on mere leadership goals. In this kind of education, religious identity and institutional identity tend to overlap. In my own field experience, I've encountered this kind of monastic schooling only at the Institute of Studies located in Dobao, Jiangsu. And Jimin's approach to Buddhist education was inspired by this sentence from the Abhidharma Kosha Sastra: the Buddha's true Dharma has 2 aspects, namely teachings and experience as its essence. So, like Miao Jin, Jimin organized doctrinal teachings by focusing for months on a single text at a time, integrating this study with meditation and ritual practice. Positions within his communities were granted based on the results achieved through this kind of training. And just to conclude, it should also be added that all of this is, of course, distinct from, though it may be complemented by informal individual instruction that I am not considering in these slides. So, within, between, and beyond institutions, in my abstract that you may have read, I promised to examine how different monastic communities and individual members negotiate religious and institutional identities within the broader society by exploring their diverse networks and interlocutors. Due to time constraints, I will limit this discussion to the lay Buddhists and to common worshippers in a few significant examples drawn from my case studies. And let us begin again with Tiexian Se in 1996. In Tiesianse, the nuns were not devoted to any Buddhist rituals. That was told to me immediately by Longlien, as if this was something to be proud of. By Buddhist rituals, I mean, of course, rituals for the dead, which, as is well known, represent one of the main sources of income for Buddhist monasteries, particularly in rural areas or on the outskirts of cities, as Tiesianse was at that time. Gaining access to the monastic compound was not easy. Not only for me as a researcher, I needed to know a code at the door to be recognized and could only visit when summoned or granted permission. But this was the same also applied to ordinary practitioners. Worshippers were welcomed only during major religious festivals. At that time, Tiesianse's primary economic support came from the Institute of Studies, which prevented the monastery from relying on ritual income. After the institute moved out, the monastery began transforming into a tourist venue. A change also prompted by the expansion of Chengdu's urban area. The monastery was quickly transformed from a rural, secluded site into an open urban monastery, welcoming religious tourism with explanatory signs and vibrant colors. This now provides an income greater than that received from Buddhist rituals. Still, as the Nineries' hybridity in rituals and practices, which you can see appreciate in these pictures here, it is clearly tantric, makes it less appealing for traditional ritual services within a Chinese Buddhist context. So a comparable situation can be found at Shifosse, the headquarters of Mahasati Dynamic Vipassana in mainland China. Here, the main economic source came from lay practitioners' donations, particularly during meditation retreats. Xuzhi emphasized the combination of Mahayana liturgies to counter accusation of Hinayana practice, and Chinese Buddhist liturgy was also observed during Ulamban, so during the festival for feeding hungry ghosts in the middle of the 7th month. Upon request, the nuns were also willing to supervise death rituals. However, few local devotees chose Shefo Temple for their Buddhist services, preferring the mainstream Chinese monasteries in the area. A different approach has been taken by Guopin at Baitas, where there is a constant flow of worshippers, partly because the white pagoda that you have seen in a previous slide is said to have been founded by the Ashokan emissary and is thus a pilgrimage site. The monastic community celebrates religious festivals according to Chinese liturgies, and daily services are also fully Chinese Buddhist. Funerary rituals and rites for the dead are also held, and Chan or Pure Land masters may be invited. Furthermore, Guoping has not only received, as we have seen, Tibetan transmissions from Longlien and her Shanshi, among others, but she has also received a particular Chan transmission from one of the last living disciples of Master Xu Yun. And in 2018, she invited him to bestow bodhisattva precepts on Chinese devotees at Baitas. The hybridity of the meditation practice, mainly Dzogchen, as you can see in this slide, but also with some Gelugpa practices from Nanhai's tradition, I said the hybridity of the meditation practice only involves the private cultivation of the nuns at Guopin's growing circle of closest lay devotees. These examples illustrate how hybridity can have a double effect in the cases analyzed. On the one hand, it provides strong roots for the community's religious and institutional identity. On the other hand, however, it may become an obstacle to engaging with a broader lay community, an important interlocutor for the monastery's economy, as we've seen. unless measures are taken to smooth out the differences in the institution's public face, as has been done by Guoping at Baitas. And this is my final part. I'm approaching the conclusion of my presentation. I have finally arrived at the key question of my talk. How do individual monastics shape or reshape their religious identities through personal networks that often extend beyond the boundaries of monastic institutions? As mentioned, at least in my own fieldwork experience, this form of agency and freedom was exercised primarily by elitist monastics, while ordinary members of the Sangha tend to identify more closely with a singular institution. To move beyond the boundaries of a particular institution, a monk or nun can rely on their educational networks, by which I mainly mean here those established through institutes of Buddhist studies. I regard this as a powerful form of institutional identity that extends beyond individual institutional boundaries. Conversely, the institutional identity of a specific monastery is primarily related to its Dharma lineage or a religious lineage, which forms its religious identity. Individual monastics may choose to leave their institutional affiliation in order to join other institutions where they can find peers who share the same religious identity, provided, of course, that they receive permission from both the original institution and the state. This is, for instance, the case of some nuns from the Symposium who intentionally left mainstream Chinese nunneries to practice Theravada meditation at Symposium. Alternatively, individual monastics may negotiate their religious identity while retaining their original institutional affiliation, which can be accomplished by activating external networks. And this, for instance, is the case of Theravada practitioners who remain within their original Chinese Buddhist communities that may not have a strong meditation practice, and so have space there to practice Theravada meditation. Again, I'm just quoting cases related to the Symposium. So to conclude, and I do think I should have a little bit time left, yes. So to conclude, let me finish with a case study, the last one that I've been working on in mainland China, the case of Xuzhi, whom I was introduced again by Guoping. Networks and are fundamental also for the researchers, as we all know. Xuzhi, a native of Sichuan, began her monastic journey as a probationer at Tieciansi in 1989, where she studied under Longlian. Her Tongsheng master was Guangshou, the guest prefect at Tieciansi, which connected her early training to Nanhai's Sino-Tibetan Buddhist tradition. After studying at Chengdu Aitao Tang, again Sino-Tibetan Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism, hybridity involved, and at Aitao Tang she completed a training course at Peishun Ban. She continued her studies at the prestigious and famous Minnan Buddhist Academy, where she received a modern form of education. In 2006, she became a Mahasati practitioner in Luang Tong's tradition, traveled to Thailand, was recognized as a fully qualified Mahasati master, and eventually founded a Mahasati center at Symposium in 2016. At the nunnery at Symposium, Xuzhi developed a hybrid approach to teaching, integrating Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism in areas not directly related to meditation practice, which remained strictly Theravada. And She also included Tibetan teachings, such as Lamrim, in her lectures. This reflects the enduring influence of her Sino-Tibetan Buddhist masters, as well as of other Gelugpa Tibetan masters she encountered later. But at the same time, this reveals a consistent preference for a non-sectarian understanding of Buddhism. Unsurprisingly, Shuje sees no contradiction also between Mahasati and Chan. While, as I have said, there is no evidence of hybridity in the meditation technique itself, which remains purely Mahasati, the same cannot be said about the ultimate goal of the practice, as expressed by Shuje's interpretation, and I quote her words here. Aratship, she said, is in no contradiction with Buddhahood. And again, bodhicitta arises spontaneously from the practice of Mahasati, which for her imbues Mahasati with a Mahayana essence. So as a result, the monastic identity of Shefo's temple's nuns, not only of Shuje, but also of her disciples, remained strictly and distinctly Chinese Buddhist, although they embraced an alternative Theravada form of Buddhist practice. So at Shepos, Shuje emerged institutional identity with a highly hybrid form of religiosity. However, this approach was sustainable only for a few years. After Shefo Temple was closed on October 25, 2023, Shuje moved to a Theravada temple in western Yunnan province, where she remains active teaching Mahasati to Chinese practitioners. She also plans to go to Tibet to teach Mahasati and practice there. So Shuje's case, with her networks, affiliations, and practices, making her an extreme example of a porous identity, her case demonstrates how institutional affiliation and religiosity can be negotiated and continually reshaped in a process of constant metamorphosis. Thank you. I have finished my presentation.